Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Robert. And thank you, Janaya, for making this possible. And thank you to members of 501 and 502 who are with us today. I don't intend to talk for the full time. I am eager to get questions and comments from you all. So please stay with us and feel free to post them. Our plan is to do 3 presentations about Minnesota's labor history. And I think I've been quite intentional about using the term or terms building blocks of Minnesota's labor movement. And we'll be talking today and in October and December about what it means to be a labor movement. Not just a union, but part of a movement. It's interesting today to be meeting. Last night, the Teamsters Union announced that UPS workers had voted by about 86% to accept a tentative agreement. Part of what's interesting is here we are experiencing historic heat in Minnesota. And one of the issues on the table for the 340,000 workers at UPS, represented by the Teamsters Union, was that many of them are working in trucks that do not have air conditioning. If you have followed the story closely, you will also know that many of these trucks had surveillance cameras so that management could track the workers, but they lacked air conditioning. And were those 340,000 workers not unionized? And were we not in a historic moment in the United States where the labor movement is on an upsurge? It's pretty likely that our UPS drivers would be delivering to our homes today, next month, next year, without air conditioning in their trucks. So being organized is not only about wages and benefits, it's about being treated with respect and about being able to work in a safe work environment. But even though they were 340,000 workers, they could not have achieved what they've achieved in this contract were they not part of a labor movement, which today includes young folks working at Starbucks and Trader Joe's, folks with higher educations working at the Science Museum of Minnesota and the Minnesota Historical Society, all kinds of working women and men who are organizing today and building solidarity with each other. And so I want to provide a historical foundation for that in my presentations today, in October, and in December. And we'll take more or less a 50-year chunk in each. And because of what happened at UPS with the Teamsters, I wanted to start today with a little-known story, the story of a young woman named Eva McDonald, later Eva McDonald Valesh, who hired into woolen blanket factories on the Minneapolis riverfront, like where the Guthrie Theater is today and the Mill City Museum, and writing under the pseudonym of Eva Gay in an obscure publication called the St. Paul Globe. She wrote a series of articles called Among Girls Who Toil. And she told the stories of the working conditions that immigrant and native-born women were facing working in these factories up and down that strip of Minneapolis. And they were becoming part of the labor movement at that time, 1888, 1889, in an organization with the wonderful name, the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. And this organization was the first labor organization in the United States to include immigrants as well as native born, women as well as men, African Americans as well as whites, unskilled as well as skilled, and to organize them together as a way to build community and build solidarity. I see someone has already raised a hand. I don't know, Michael, can you handle the chat in the short run and let me know if I need to stop and take a question before I'm done?
Yeah, happy to do so. I'll unmute Jackie and see if she has a question.
Sure, and I'm more than happy to take them in case I'm not being clear or there are issues already arising. I do want to have a conversation.
Yeah. So Jackie, you should be able to unmute now if you'd like. Otherwise, yeah, there we go.
Sorry, you guys, that was a mistake. I was trying to look into the chat. Sorry about that.
So the webinar chat version of a butt dial. Okay, thank you, Jackie. So Eva Valesh called attention to the conditions that these women were working in. They were not unionized. They could not engage in collective bargaining, but other members of the Knights of Labor could bring solidarity to them and attention to the miserable working conditions and low wages that they were experiencing. The Knights of Labor were the first labor organization in the United States to have as a motto, an injury to one is the concern of all. A motto that would later be adapted by the industrial workers of the world as an injury to one is an injury to all. So when we think about a labor movement, we think about solidarity at the heart of it. And I want to tell a story that many of us don't know, and we don't know these stories not because we're ignorant, but we know these stories because they weren't part of the curriculum when we were in school, whether it was high school or college. The holiday of Labor Day owes its existence to workers in St. Paul, Minnesota. No kidding. In April of 1894, railroad workers employed by James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad went on strike after Hill had cut their wages twice since the economy had slid into a depression in the summer of 1893. And in April of 1894, railroad workers went on strike. Their meeting place was right here on the east side of St. Paul at 896 Payne Avenue. And the workers would meet. It was the upstairs of the building owned by a mutual benefit society. So this is before the days of workers' compensation, before the days when insurance companies in the United States would sell insurance, workplace insurance to workers. And so workers created mutual insurance in order to care for themselves and each other. And they offered their meeting space on the second floor of 896 Payne Avenue to the striking railroad workers. And the railroad workers were already practicing solidarity in their own ranks because they had come initially from a situation where they had as many as 14 separate unions. The engineers had their own. The locomotive firemen had their own. The brakemen, the switchmen, the trainmen, the conductors, the maintenance of way workers, each of them had a separate union. And in 1893, a remarkable guy named Eugene Victor Debs, who had been born in Terre Haute, Indiana, given the middle name Victor to connect him to the French writer Victor Hugo. The Eugene Victor Debs, who had been a locomotive fireman, came to the conclusion that it was ridiculous for railroad workers to be organized in 14 different unions when they were dealing with the largest employers in the United States. And Debs began something called the American Railway Union. And the birth of that union coincided with the Depression that began in 1893 and the moves by what were then called robber barons. Today, I like to call them oligarchs, like James J. Hill, responded to the Depression by cutting their workers' wages. And so the strikers met upstairs at 896 Payne Avenue, and at the end of their strike meetings, they would march to the railroad overpass on Payne Avenue, just north of Minnehaha Avenue, and they would carry garbage, and they would sing as they marched, and when they got to the overpass, they dumped their garbage on the tracks that James J. Hill's trains were running on, being operated by strikebreakers that he had hired. And they succeeded in making such a mess that the trains could not get through. And George Pillsbury, another oligarch in the flour milling industry, Mr. Pillsbury reached out to Mr. Hill and said, "Your workers are interfering with the ability of my company to sell our flour in Europe." Because what the flour mills of Minneapolis were doing was shipping their flour from Minneapolis to Duluth. And in Duluth, the flour barrels were offloaded onto ocean-going ships that crossed Lake Superior, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and the Atlantic Ocean, and reached the marketplace in Europe, where they actually undersold flour that had been milled in Europe out of wheat that had been grown there. This would precipitate a second great wave of European migration to the United States, particularly from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Croatia, Serbia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Turkey, Greece. And Pillsbury complained that he couldn't get his flour to Europe because Hill had pissed his workers off so much. And he offered to arbitrate the conflict. In April of 1894, labor history in the United States would see the first ever arbitration of a strike. And Hill expected that Pillsbury would side with him, but lo and behold, Pillsbury said he recommended that Hill restore the wages that he had cut. And Hill had agreed to the process, and so he gave in. And the strike ended after 2 weeks. The workers got their wages back, and the word spread throughout the United States among railroad workers and people in communities where railroad workers lived that Eugene Debs's American Railway Union had made Big Jim Hill back down. In a suburb of Chicago called Pullman, where workers built sleeping cars for the railroads, sleeping cars that were, not surprisingly, called Pullman cars, working for a guy named George Pullman. I've always said it's a bad sign if you work in a town that's named for the boss. Pullman was a company town. And like a good-thinking oligarch, George Pullman had decided to cut his workers' wages during the Depression and not reduce their rent. And the workers had the temerity to complain that that wasn't fair. And when they heard that the workers on the Great Northern Railroad had gotten James J. Hill to back down, they reached out to Eugene Debs. And they said, well, we hear you're the guy that says all railroad workers ought to be in the same union. Now, we don't work on moving trains. We actually build sleeping cars. Can we join your union? And this was in June of 1894, 2 months after the Great Northern Strike had settled. And Debs was still, I think, feeling a little bit of an ego crest having backed down Big Jim Hill. And Deb said, sure, you can join my union. And the Pullman workers then responded and said, well, thank you for the invitation. We forgot to mention that we're already on strike. And Deb said, that's no problem. We'll organize solidarity for you. And Deb's put out a call for what he called borrowing from Irish history. He called for a boycott of any train that had a Pullman car. Now, interestingly, Pullman had a monopoly on the building of Pullman cars. And there was no separation in the United States between freight trains and passenger trains. As a result, virtually every train in the United States had a Pullman car. And so Debs was really calling for a nationwide railroad strike, calling it a boycott of Pullman cars. 125,000 railroad workers went on strike. The workers in St. Paul, who had only gone back to work a month and a half earlier, went back on strike to support the workers in Pullman outside of Chicago. Mr. Pullman then found another card to play. He reached out to the former Attorney General of the United States and made him the Pullman Company's corporate counsel, Richard Olney. And Olney went shopping for a sympathetic judge. We see a lot today of how that kind of thing happens. And he found a judge in Chicago, and he went into court and he said, Your Honor, this strike is interfering with the shipment of the nation's mail, because not only does every train have a Pullman car or two, but every train also has a U.S. mail car. We ask for you to issue an injunction against this strike. And the judge gave in, put down his gavel, said, I am ordering the American Railway Union to call off this strike. Bring Eugene Debs into my courtroom. And Debs presented himself, the judge made his order, and Debs refused. The judge said, then I find you in contempt of court. Bailiff, take this man away. Now, I didn't even understand all of the dimensions of this until I was involved with the Hormel strike in 1986, when a local judge, a federal judge, Edward Devitt, threatened to find the leaders of UFCW Local P9 in contempt of his court if they did not take down the picket lines around the Hormel plant in Austin. And the union leaders contacted me because I was the college professor who was supposed to know everything. And I was certainly a lot cheaper than asking a lawyer for an opinion. They asked me, what does it mean if we're found in federal contempt? And I dug back into this story and I discovered that Debs would spend the next 18 months in prison. And that in fact, there was no time limit for what you would serve if a judge found you in contempt. And secondly, there was no way to appeal a contempt citation. Most of us have watched too many TV shows, Law and Order or Perry Mason if we're old enough, where we saw some crusading journalist be found in contempt by a judge, taken off to a jail cell, and by the next commercial, she was out of jail. Didn't seem like much to us. Deb spent 18 months in prison. The strike eventually was weakening, but only had another card to play on Pullman's behalf. He reached out to his friend, President Grover Cleveland, and told Cleveland that this nationwide boycott of Pullman cars, really a nationwide railroad strike, was preventing the U.S. economy from pulling itself out of this depression that it was in. And President Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago to break the picket lines and put an end to the strike. There was violence. Over 30 strikers were shot and killed by the US Army. And President Cleveland's advisors sitting around the Oval Office, again, I think we can picture this dialogue, said to him, well, we think you've shot yourself in the foot, Grover. How are you going to get reelected after you've alienated all of these labor activists and workers? We need to come up with an idea. And the idea they came up with was that President Grover Cleveland should create the national holiday of Labor Day and use that as a way to win back the sympathies of working class voters. And in September of 1894, the United States celebrated its first national Labor Day holiday. Fortunately, from my point of view, President Cleveland did not get reelected, even though he had created the Labor Day holiday. But its roots are right here on the east side of St. Paul with the railroad workers and their community supporters who struck in the spring of 1894. Now, when we think about, or I try to think about, how that helps us understand what is a labor movement, that we see in 1894 that there's a movement among Minnesota farmers called the Farmers Alliance. If you've ever visited the Oliver Kelly Farm in Elk River, it was the birthplace of the Farmers Alliance and populism here in the state of Minnesota. The Knights of Labor joined with farmers. Both of them hated railroads, the owners of railroads like James J. Hill, more than anyone else they saw as an antagonist. And so they moved into political activism together. They created these mutual benefit societies. I studied with a brilliant labor historian named David Montgomery. And I still remember David saying in a lecture in a course covering this time period, he said, you know, if you said the term labor movement in the 1890s, you actually had to think of 5 different kinds of organizations. There were unions, there were benefit societies, there were cooperatives, there were organizations fighting on issues like the 8-hour day. Like today, we've had organizations fighting for $15 an hour. And there were labor political parties. 5 organizations making up a labor movement. And a labor movement which by the 1890s, embodied in the Knights of Labor and the American Railway Union, included women as well as men, immigrants as well as whites, as well as native-born, African Americans as well as native-born whites. This was the labor movement. And that's really the basis. Those are whose shoulders we stand on today when we're public employees bargaining with the state of Minnesota, when we're Teamsters bargaining with UPS, when we're auto workers bargaining with the big 3 auto companies. We are really not alone, but we're part of a rich, variegated movement. And so what I'm hoping to do with you over the next our next 3 meetings is really talk about how that movement expands and the challenges that it faces beginning in this period of the late 19th and early 20th century, a period that here in Minnesota in 1924 would see the organization of the Farmer Labor Party, the first statewide third party grounded in the labor movement in the United States. It's self-inspired by what was accomplished by an organization called the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota. The Nonpartisan League, which gained control of the North Dakota state legislature in 1912 and created the first state bank anywhere in the United States. And the North Dakota State Bank, which lent money to farmers to build their own silos so that they would not be beholden to the railroads, but also that included the clause that if you got a loan from the North Dakota State Bank to invest in a business, you had to demonstrate that you were paying a living wage. That's 1912 in North Dakota. And that inspired workers and farmers in Minnesota to create the Farmer Labor Party in 1924 that would ultimately elect 2 governors, 3 senators, 6 congressmen over the next decade and a half. So this is a multifaceted movement that we find our roots in. And I suspect that, first of all, this is something that nobody, I'm sure, taught you when you were in high school or college. We're in the midst of quite a fight these days about what the governor of Florida is doing to education there and how the ideas are spreading, that young people should not be taught African American history, that young people should not be taught the history of slavery. And the fact that they're not saying, let's not teach them about the labor movement, tells us they're already not teaching them about the labor movement. Fortunately, today, unions like the St. Paul Federation of Educators and Education Minnesota are educating their own members so that they can become more effective teachers of this kind of material, and so that young people will be learning this history going forward. So I'm just trying to check the time. Well, let me just say a little bit more. One more East Side story. So at the corner of Payne Avenue and Jessamine, 1 block away from the East Side Freedom Library, is a pretty unassuming home, like most of the homes on the East Side. And it was built by a Swedish immigrant stonemason named Nils Nelson. And it turns out that Nils Nelson was the president of the Stonecutters Union at the time of the building of the Minnesota State Capitol. If you're unfamiliar with the story of the building of the Minnesota State Capitol, I urge you to Google who built our state capitol, and there is a marvelous hour-long documentary video and a fantastic website put together by Randy Croce and Howard Kling, who worked at the Labor Education Service at the University of Minnesota, and involved interviewing the descendants of workers who built the Minnesota State Capitol. And Nils Nilsson is at the center of that story. He was about 6'5" with flaming red hair and a big red beard. And he got into a fight while the Capitol was being built with someone whose name far more people know, Cass Gilbert, the architect. And Gilbert and Nils Nelson got into an argument about how many workers were needed for different parts of the job. And Gilbert went to the Butler Brothers contractors who were running the job and demanded that they fire Nils Nelson. And they yielded to Cass Gilbert, fired Nelson. Gilbert went back to New York, and they immediately hired Nils Nelson back because he was so central to the way the Capitol was being built. I do walking tours of the immigrant history and labor history of the East Side. We start in Sweet Hollow, we come up Payne Avenue, ending at the East Side Freedom Library, but we stop at the home that had been built by Nils Nelson. There's something charming to me as a labor historian and a bit of a troublemaker, I guess, charming to discover that the back stoop of the house and the sidewalk in the backyard all look suspiciously like the stone that went into the Minnesota State Capitol. And I suspect that that stone came home under cover of darkness with Brother Nelson. In 1916, he attempted to run for Congress as an anti-war candidate. He was unsuccessful, but he lived a lifetime in that house and was a looming presence on the East Side. Last year, St. Paul Public Schools introduced a critical ethnic studies course for 10th graders in all public high schools in St. Paul. I had the joy of being on the advisory committee to that process and being invited to take the teachers from a dozen high schools who would be teaching this course on my walking tour. And when we got to Nils Nelson's house and I showed them the sidewalk, one of the teachers, a Hmong woman who was teaching at Como High School, broke down and cried. And I thought, man, you're a great storyteller. Look at this response. And I said to her, why are you crying, sister? And she said, when my family came to St. Paul in 1983, we lived in this house. My grandparents, my parents, my brothers and sisters, and me. We lived in this house. And she said, today is the first time I've heard of Nils Nelson. And one of my favorite sayings is, where's the plaque on this building? There needs to be a plaque on that house telling the story of Nils Nelson. And I said to her, you know, the spirit of Nils Nelson is moving in you, even though you and your family had not heard of him before. Nils Nelson would be looking down on us from labor heaven, appreciative that there is now a critical ethnic studies course for all 10th graders in St. Paul. So part of being in the labor movement is not only receiving solidarity from other workers, but it's also about extending solidarity to other workers and exploring other ways of organizing, not just unions, organizing benefit organizations, organizing cultural and social organizations, organizing and being active politically. These are all parts of what the labor movement was and parts of what the labor movement is today, even if all those pieces have not been integrated together. So I want to close this presentation today by inviting all of you to come and join us at the Eastside Freedom Library for what we're calling a Labor Day picnic, though it's not on Labor Day itself. It will be Saturday, September 9, so the Saturday after Labor Day. we will be convening hopefully a whole mixed bag of folks, some of them in unions, some of them in grassroots organizations, some of them want to be parts of organizations, fighting for $15 an hour, fighting for immigrant rights, fighting for respect and safety for workers. We'll have music, we'll have food. You all know that by September 9th, the sweet corn should be at its best. Come and join us on the lawn of the library from 6 to 8 p.m. Saturday, September 9. So let me see, Michael and Janaya, if there are questions that or comments that people would like to raise.
Yep. So far we have one. I also just want to note that I posted the link to the Labor Day Solidarity Picnic in the chat if folks are interested. I am very lucky to have seen the Eastside Freedom Library. I did a paper in college that required me to get some sources from there. And it's a beautiful place, beautiful neighborhood. But one of the first questions that we have is asking about what is your personal experience with immigration? Do you mind sharing if your family history is an outcome of migration to America?
Thank you. I'm not sure I've ever actually been asked that. My family is a mixed bag of Eastern European Jews, some from Ukraine, some from Lithuania, some from Russia. My grandmother on my mother's side told me that when she and my grandfather announced their engagement, and she was Lithuanian Jewish and he was Ukrainian Jewish, that there were members of the family who were concerned that it was a mixed marriage, even though they were Orthodox Jews all over on both sides, because one was Ukrainian and one was Lithuanian. That kind of experience has helped me understand some of what we've experienced at the Eastside Freedom Library, where we've worked with our East African neighbors, Ethiopians, some of whom are Amhara, some of whom are Oromo, and though to many people they're just East Africans or Ethiopians, they're really trying to navigate their separate histories and figure out how, being on the east side of St. Paul together, they're beginning to understand each other and how to transmit that understanding back to their family members who are still living in Ethiopia. We've had similar experiences with our Hmong and Karen neighbors. With our Hmong neighbors, some of whom speak Green Hmong and some of whom spoke White Hmong, and are now developing a kind of solidarity and cultural blending. I was able to teach a working class history course through an exciting local project called the New Brookwood Labor College. I encourage you to look them up on Google and look at their classes. And as I taught this working class history course for New Brookwood, one of my students, who was a Tibetan business agent for SEIU Healthcare Minnesota, decided to create an organization. This is after the murder of George Floyd, created an organization called Tibetans for Black Lives. And being of a younger generation than I and adept with use of the internet, he's now helped create Tibetans for Black Lives in 5 countries around the world. And I like to think about the word diaspora and how people are, through immigration, dispersed through diaspora, but how solidarity can be a way that people build new collective identities that are grounded in supporting each other I've really learned in doing my immigrant and labor history walking tours that most immigrants come to the United States, whether it's Ukrainian and Lithuanian Jews in the 1880s and 1890s, or Hmong in the 1980s and 90s, or Karen in the 2000s, that they often come to the United States with a deeper sense of mutuality, of caring for each other, than many of us are educated and socialized into being. And it's helped me rethink the concept of Americanization. What does it mean for schools or social service agencies to try to Americanize immigrants? And it has far too often meant not just teaching them to be patriotic and learn the Declaration of Independence or to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, but it's to teach them to be individualistic and competitive. And when that light bulb went on for me, I began to think we have more to learn from our immigrant neighbors about how to get through life safely and productively than they have to learn from us. We should be their students rather than they being assumed to be ours. And something that also, helped me understand that, I stumbled across a document when I was doing research on Croatian immigration, a document from Hibbing, 1925, from an adult night school. And the curriculum was entitled Americanizing the Immigrant Woman Through Home Economics. And it said, you need to start out with a plate that has built-in dividers in it. Those of you who are old enough to remember TV dinners know what that looked like. And you need to teach these women that they should put meat in one compartment, potatoes in another department, and vegetables in the third compartment. And so no booyah, no hot dish, get them to separate these items. And I think how wonderful it is now that there is a TV show on Channel 2 called Relish. I urge you all to look for it if you have Passport. This wonderful, brilliant Hmong chef, Yia Vang, interviews immigrant chefs on every episode, and they make a meal together, and you sure couldn't put it into the separate compartments of a TV dinner-like plate. So our own immigrant histories have a lot to teach us about solidarity and mutuality. More questions, Michael?
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter. Our next question comes from Isaiah. They asked, with workers' rights being challenged across the board, and with an increase in unionization movements, railroad strikes, Starbucks unionization efforts, the writers' strike, and so on, it seems like workers' rights, are under attack at an increasing rate. Do you think that is true, or is that recency bias? If it is true, do you think a push for a unified working class movement that isn't separated by profession is needed to ensure continuous workers' rights moving forward?
Well, Isaiah, thank you so much for that question. I think that the more that the unions can come together and be a labor movement, the more, so let's say, and the more that they can address the concerns of all working people and not just their dues-paying members, the stronger we will be and the better we will be able to get laws passed that respect the rights of working people. So if the UPS drivers through the Teamsters have now won that they should be driving in air-conditioned trucks the next time you see a FedEx driver, the next time you see an Amazon driver, the next time you see a DHL driver, ask them, have you got air conditioning in your truck? What could we do to get air conditioning in your trucks? And it could be that they need to unionize and get their own employers to do it. Or it could be that we all need to come together as a working class movement and demand that our state governments or our federal governments make air conditioning mandatory in trucks that are driven by delivery drivers.
Yeah.
What is a decent minimum wage? 10 years ago when 15 Now broke on the scene, there were some unions, and I won't name them, but there were some unions that said, we can't support this idea because we have dues-paying members who aren't even making that much now. Well, we need to raise the floor. And if we raise the floor, we make it possible for others to do even better. The federal minimum wage today is still $7.25 an hour. There are people talking about a $20 or $25 minimum wage as what should be reasonable to support a reasonable lifestyle for a working class family. So how do we use legislation? How do we get together to build the base that can get legislation passed that will raise the floor in terms of working conditions, in terms of wages and benefits for all of us? There are those in the labor movement and beyond who are trying to get Medicare for all, a single-payer healthcare system in the United States, like many other modern industrialized countries have. What would it take to build the political power to get those kinds of laws passed? So, Isaiah, we definitely need to keep building our base, building our solidarity in order to not just prevent anti-labor legislation, but to get pro-worker legislation passed. Michael, we got anything else?
Yep. So the next two are more of comments, and I'm just going to group them together because they're both similar. The first one is just a note that it would be beautiful to hear more of your Jewish history stories, and then thanking you for sharing your story. And then another person, again, thanking you for your presentation, saying that there was great information and they got a lot out of it. And then we have a question from Brent. Thanks for all you do. As someone who was lucky enough to take some classes from the late, great Hy Berman, I really hope I'm saying that right, I really appreciate it. It looks like the kids in Florida will also be getting anti-labor propaganda in the form of PragerU. Is there anything that can be done on the national level to prevent this from happening?
So there's a lot going on. There are great things happening against the concept of, and practice of banning books. At the Eastside Freedom Library, we're going to have a series of programs this coming fall about the challenge of book banning. We'll be hearing from two brilliant African-American scholars, Robin D.G. Kelly and Roderick Ferguson. Robin is at UCLA, Rod is at Yale. Both of them have written books that are now banned in Florida. There is pushback. Our efforts here in Minnesota, not just to get critical ethnic studies into the St. Paul schools, but also the Minnesota legislature passed a bill this last session mandating ethnic studies, very vaguely defined, but it's a start, for greater Minnesota, all over the state, that there should be ethnic studies. So we need to support our teachers' unions and our librarians and their efforts to make sure that their students and their library patrons have access to a wide range of ideas in the books that can be put in front of them. It would be great to see the whole labor movement come together behind librarians and teachers, which is part of what we want to inspire through the East Side Freedom Library. So, there's a lot to do, but I think I used to say, and I still say, that the rebuilding of the labor movement is a labor-intensive process. And so means and ends are connected. If our end is to have a labor movement that involves a wide range of people, that people feel like it is their movement and not just an insurance policy that their dues pay for, the way we get there is by doing more things that need more people to do, so that people take ownership by getting involved. And I think we're at a moment in our nation's history where that is happening. I also want to say before we close that whoever was asking for more about my family's immigration history and Jewish immigration history generally, I want to encourage any and all of you to reach out to me by email. You can reach me, it's easy. You can reach me at peter@eastsidefreedomlibrary.org, and I'd be very glad to respond to any questions or thoughts that you have that we don't get to today. And thank you for mentioning Hi Berman. Hi had a tremendous impact on the awareness of labor history here in the state of Minnesota, from his students, from people who saw him on Almanac, people who saw him on the news. Hi was a great, what we would call, public intellectual, and his contributions are immense. And I want to add that we have Hi Berman's personal library at the East Side Freedom Library, that after Hi and his partner Betty passed away, his kids donated his books to us. And it includes Hi's own PhD dissertation, as well as dissertations that were written under his direction. So we love to have books that have a personal connection. Anything else, Michael?
There's one more question, which I'll get to in just a second. I just want to, before we close out, do a couple things. So first, I want to remind folks that, this is the first part in a 3-part series. So if you've enjoyed your time here today, I know I have, please join us in October and in December. We'll get those dates nailed down here relatively soon. And then also I would ask you all, we've learned about the importance of solidarity and being there for our fellow worker. I would encourage you all, if you are a MAPE represented employee who has not become a member, to please consider becoming a member. Feel free to reach out to either me or Janaea, and we can talk through that with you. And then the final thing I'll just highlight is that we have gotten consent from Anna Peterson and the People and Culture team that if you think that these presentations are important for you to do your job, for example, if you work with workers, knowing labor history, since many of us are the Department of Employment and Economic Development, is important, because as we see, these constant issues of solidarity, of inequity in the workplace affect the people that we serve today. So I would encourage you to have a conversation with your supervisors about counting this towards your annual professional development as well. And with that, the final question, and I apologize, I'm going to have to sign off right after I say this because I have to get ready for a site visit, but comes from someone who said, I recently spoke with an African-American young woman who explained to me that she felt embarrassed and victimized by the constant discussion of Black suppression in high school and college. She mentioned how her and her family fully support the anti-victimization that's being promoted in states like Florida. And she thinks there's a way to make African Americans proud to be who they are, and most diversity and Africology classes are doing the opposite. Have you heard of that? And I apologize, I do have to step off, but feel free to keep going. Janaea's here and she'll help with moderating questions and stuff.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for hosting this today, and for suggesting that we do this at all.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. I think that we always walk a complicated tightrope between seeing the ways that people are victimized, whether it's women, whether it's GLBTQ plus folks, whether it's people of color, whether it's immigrants, the ways that they're victimized on the one hand, and the ways that they're able to empower themselves on the other. And those things are woven together. And any education, such as the one that Governor DeSantis wants to promote in Florida, that African Americans should be thankful for slavery because it taught them the skills of being a blacksmith and made them Christians. So it's all just the good stuff. That's way one-sided. Nor if we presented, as when I first began to study the history of slavery, the dominant narrative produced, interestingly, by Jewish historians, Stanley Elkins in particular. The idea that slavery operated like a concentration camp in which resistance was impossible. My generation of historians, fortunately, took on the task of discovering the ways that resistance had been an important part of enslaved people's experiences. So yes, they were victimized. Yes, they were not compensated for their labor. Yes, families were broken up. Women were subjected to sexual abuse. Many, many, many nefarious things happened to enslaved people. But they also created a culture. They also practiced their own traditions, honored their own values, ran away when they could. 180,000 joined the Union Army during the Civil War. 180,000. So there was resistance as well as victimization. And I think that today's historians, for the most part, do a much better job of presenting the complexity of those interactions rather than presenting a one-sided history. So, Janaya, I imagine people have to get back to work, and I should let you all go. Janaya, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you so much for your time today, Peter, and thank you everyone for attending. I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So as Michael mentioned, this is the first in a three-part series, and so we'll be sure to communicate the future dates with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peter. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well.